It's great to be here. Thank you. The last time I spoke in chapel, which was a few years ago, I didn't know that my image was so monstrously projected here behind me. It's an example of the truth of the cliche, ignorance is bliss. Oh well. One college, one book, a terrific idea. I want to begin by asking that if you read or in the process of reading Bonhoeffer's Life Together, if you would please stand up right now. If you're read it or in the process of reading it, please stand up. All right, good, terrific, thank you. Sit down, all right. One of my favorite moments every year is at convocation when the students all stand up together to be prayed for, and there's this thunder. That's the Wheaton thunder for me, and it's a great reminder of why I love teaching here. Part of the reason why I agreed to the abomination of my projected image to speak in chapel is because I'm 100% behind the idea of the whole college community reading one book together. I hope we keep it going. I hope this is just the beginning of a very long stretch of choices. It's a wonderful opportunity to think together about some ideas that can shape us as a community. Part of what I really like about the idea is that it's somewhat countercultural, in that one of the very real effects of our current technologically advanced culture, coupled with changes in our view toward the study of literature, is that the culture that we have in common, our shared cultural experience, if you will, has been thinned out and dumbed down. While there are plenty of good things to read out there, our shared cultural experience is often reduced to a handful of movies we have all seen, or else a YouTube that's recently gone viral. In fact, I've heard a statistic that after about 20 minutes, any conversation in America will have turned to the movies. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that this diminishes the quality of conversations that we are able to have. If the movie everyone is talking about is something like The Hangover, there are going to be some real limits to what we can learn together. But one college, one book. In addition to our even more powerful collective commitment to the Holy Scriptures, gives us the chance to root our lives together in a shared reading experience. And when that shared reading experience is a gem, like Life Together, we are blessed indeed. What a rich book. In some ways, this was one of the most difficult talks I ever had to put together because there are so many things in this book that I was tempted to focus on. And the title on Bonhoeffer is a little misleading. I'm really going to be talking about Life Together, not about Bonhoeffer. I'm not an expert on Bonhoeffer, but this book really moved me. I could talk about, for instance, Bonhoeffer's great insights into the need to be alone in order to be together, and to be together in order to be alone. Or I could talk about his view of suffering, which is a topic of real recent interest for me. Or I could talk about the way he celebrates the joy of corporate singing, which is something I've recently begun to appreciate more and more. I especially enjoyed it during the inauguration. I enjoy corporate singing for the reminders of the blessing of community and how we're all in this together, quirks and all. And I say this even though I, like all Biebers, really cannot sing. But for the sake of focus, I had to choose only a couple of points to expand upon. And I'm happy to say that one of the main points I want to focus on appears at the very beginning of the book. So if you've only read 2 paragraphs, you're okay, because this is the 3rd sentence. And here it is. Bonhoeffer writes, "It is not simply to be taken for granted that the Christian has the privilege of living among other Christians." Let me read that again. It is not simply to be taken for granted that the Christian has the privilege of living among other Christians. One of the things I have appreciated most about the new leadership of President Wheaton, and I didn't know he was going to be here, is his focus on grace, a focus that became clear when he spoke to us at convocation. In fact, here I am speaking on this Monday after his inauguration and the Monday before the Wednesday's President's Chapel. It's like I'm in a Wheaton sandwich. When I said this to my husband, he said, "Yeah, that means you're the meat of the sandwich." No, wait, the cheese. Anyway, no, he's not criticizing me as much as that might sound. Anyway, at convocation, President Wheaton reminded us of the great privilege it is to be at a place like Wheaton, Not primarily because Wheaton is Wheaton and blah, 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 but because of the simple fact that we get to learn and live together with Christians as Christians. It is not simply to be taken for granted that the Christian has the privilege of living among other Christians, Bonhoeffer tells us. And a brief glance at Bonhoeffer's life should remind us of how right he was and how fortunate we are to be living in a free society and worshiping together. Bonhoeffer wrote Life Together in 1938. It was about his life as the leader in a clandestine seminary for young pastors. The seminary was secret, as you all know, because Hitler had made it illegal. Bonhoeffer knew all along that his days in Christian community were numbered. And sure enough, the Gestapo eventually shut the seminary down. Bonhoeffer then sailed to America, just as World War II was just about to be underway. But his conscience got the better of him, and he took the last ship back to Europe to be a part of the struggle. And there, he was a part of a group that plotted Hitler's assassination. He was thrown into prison, where he wrote books and letters while he was ministering to his fellow prisoners. And just before the war was almost completely over, he was executed. He was 39 years old. It is not simply to be taken for granted that the Christian has the privilege of living among other Christians. Bonhoeffer felt it was necessary to start his meditation on Life Together by reminding us of this truth. We all have a tendency, I think, to take the many blessings we have for granted, and as soon as we do that, we stop being grateful. And when gratitude goes, ugly things begin to crop up, things like cynicism, pettiness, gossip, all the things that are devastating to a community. So I want to begin by asking you to reflect in your own hearts for just a minute on this question. And this applies to students who live with Christian roommates, faculty and staff, and others who live in Christian families, and even people who live alone but still have that abundant opportunity of sharing meals and fellowship with other Christians. And that is simply this: when was the last time you really thought about and thanked God for the fact of your life together with other Christians? I encourage you to do that. I love transfer students. Are you any out there transfer students? I love you all. Because of all the students that I have ever met, you tend to be the most grateful for our life together, especially those of you who transferred from some party school somewhere. You had the vomit in the halls, the co-ed bathrooms, maybe you were sexiled by your own roommate. You know what I'm talking about. It's hard to concentrate on your studies when freedom has gone amok. Now, that's not to say that we don't have our own problems here, like inauthenticity and pettiness. But in some ways, that's my point. If we were simply more grateful for our life together here, many of those problems would vanish. So the first thing I hope you will do this year is to find a way to remember to be grateful, not just for life together, but for the opportunity or the luxury of being students. You will understand this, I think, more later in life, but for now, you just have to trust me on it. One of the things I did when I was an undergraduate was that I found a way to remember to thank God for the privilege of being a student at a great college. We had a bell that rang very loudly for classes, and I decided that every time I heard that bell, I would stop and thank God for the privilege of being a student. And though I was at a secular college, I had a fantastic Christian community, and so I thanked God for that too. This regular act of gratitude changed me. It saved me from myself. It's just hard to grumble when you're practicing gratitude. So can we all find a strategy to remember to be grateful? The need to be grateful was the thought that struck me from reading the first half of Bonhoeffer's great book. Another thought that struck me was from the end of the book, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. The thing that spoke to me in the second half of the book was Bonhoeffer's insight into how sin affects a Christian community. Specifically, he shows how sin destroys a community because sin wants to be kept secret. Because sin wants to be kept secret, confession is necessary, he argues, for communal health. Let me read the section to which I'm referring. It's on page 112 if you want to make a note. In confession, the breakthrough to community takes place. By the way, maybe some of you Wunderkind who are reading this book in German can give me some insight into this term breakthrough that he uses a lot. You can send me an email. In confession, the breakthrough to community takes place. Sin demands to have a man by himself. It withdraws him from community. The more isolated a person is, the more destructive will be the power of sin over him, and the more deeply he becomes involved in it, the more disastrous is his isolation. Sin wants to remain unknown. It shuns the light. In the darkness of the unexpressed, it poisons the whole being of a person. This can happen even in the midst of a pious community. Bonhoeffer's personification of sin is very effective here. Sin wants to remain unknown. It's there, festering, poisoning our whole being, he says. The image reminded me of Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous novel, The Scarlet Letter. Of course it would, I'm an English prof, in which Hawthorne literalized the poisoning of unexpressed sin in the body of Reverend Dimsdale. And then he also illustrated how the Reverend ended up isolated from the community as a result. But the thing that I especially like about Bonhoeffer's meditation on the poison of unexpressed sin is his emphasis on the self-deception that ensues. Now, this is the most important thing that I think I'm going to say today, is that the longer that I live, the more I think that self-deception is our biggest spiritual problem. It's the hardest one to solve. We deceive ourselves into thinking that we're living without sin, or that the things that we do when we lash out at our roommates or live in obsessive fear of bad grades, they're just the result of some personality flaw. It's not really sin and other self-deceptions. And then we deceive others into thinking that everything is okay with us. That's why self-deception is a circle. It's not unlike the image of the snake feeding on its own tail. We consume ourselves in the same way, in total isolation. If we deceive ourselves long enough, we crust over and harden into the worst versions of ourselves, making a breakthrough even harder, but thank God, not impossible. If you've ever seen the movie Dead Man Walking, you might remember the picture it paints of an extreme version of self-deception in the way that it rotted the protagonist's soul. Or just read any of Flannery O'Connor's short stories. She specialized in showing the soul-destroying power of self-deception. She believed that it's better to be called a warthog from hell, gored by a bull, or even shot by a serial killer than it is to live and die without accurate self-knowledge about your own sinfulness. Now, everybody who's a part of our community here who is honest with ourselves knows that we tend toward prideful inauthenticity that's characteristic of self-deception. This is not an easy thing to talk about, but we Wheaties often deceive ourselves as individuals and as a community about our holiness and our rightness before God. It's not an easy thing to address, but it's an even harder thing to redress. And here is Bonhoeffer giving us the opportunity to think deeply about it together. He is saying that the problem has two parts, that we are dishonest with ourselves about our own real struggles and sins when they arise, and also that we don't have the courage to help each other to see the sin that we are blind to in ourselves. So the solution is simple, but far from easy. The solution is to learn to be honest with each other and help each other to be honest with ourselves. Bonhoeffer put it so elegantly when he wrote, "Our brother breaks the circle of self-deception." But see, here's the thing. We at Wheaton are not only good at self-deception, we're also really smart, right? So we'll practice versions of confessing our sins to each other that aren't genuine at all. For instance, we'll share all of our sexy struggles with each other, or our acceptable struggles, but not our real ones. Now, I'm a perfectionist, so I have a right to slam on perfectionists. With our own particular version of pride, I know I'm not alone. The perfectionist version of sharing struggles is to get through it all by yourself and then talk about the victory. That is not what I'm talking about. I didn't really want to talk about inauthenticity today, but as I prayed about this message, it just kept coming to me that I need to challenge us to take ownership of it. And as I thought about the way that Bonhoeffer is writing about it, it reminded me that the only way to transform into a community of grace and not pride is for each of us to commit to being someone who owns up to our own sin. We have to own it. Not yesterday's sins or just the sexy sins, not somebody else's sins, but my own sins today. Because as soon as I take one step toward being honest with another human being about my own sin, that honesty immediately puts us both on the same level before God. And I think that's one of the main points of it. The point is that in that kind of honesty, pride goes right out the window. The point of that honesty is to constantly live in the reality that He is God, we are not, and we need Him. In other words, grace, grace. Now, you will note that Bonhoeffer is not talking about public confession of sin. Public confession, though it has a place, can degenerate quickly into a performance, and that could defeat the point. I think what he's talking about is cultivating relationships that are rich and authentic enough that we're actually able to confess sins meaningfully to each other with the right motives. I do have people in my life that I confess to, but I will admit to you that lately I've been doing some soul searching on this issue. I tend to confess mostly to my husband, who is also not coincidentally the person who I sin the most against. But asking for forgiveness for sin from the person you sin against, while absolutely vital, is not necessarily the type of confession that Bonhoeffer is talking about. As I thought about this, I had to admit to myself that when I was single, I was better about being transparent with my closest friends. I think I was also better about intentionally asking them to help me see areas of self-deception in my own life. Just this morning, my dear friend, Dr. Davis, was praying for me in his office, which is right next to mine, and I thought gratefully about the 11 years that we've been friends. And then I thought about the 8 years that I've been friends with Professor Mazzarella, whose office is on the other side of mine, another dear friend. Before we three of us had all these kids, and they have a quiver full, I only have one, but between us, there's a lot. We would sometimes connect by sharing our personal struggles and pray for each other, at least more often, more spontaneously than we do now. I feel the need to recover some of that. As much as my flesh resists it, as much as it wounds my pride, it's so hard, it's so hurtful. But this is important for reasons that I hope are obvious. If the problem is self-deception, then we absolutely must have somebody else's eyes to help us see our own blindness. And please, please, please hear me well here. I am not saying we should go around pointing out each other's sins, okay? God forbid, please, no self-appointed plank in your eye sin, fixers. The challenge boils down to this for me. My challenge to you is for you to acknowledge before God that you're a sinner, and you find somebody and empower them to help you to see areas in your life where you might be snared by self-deception. Empower them to do that. And needless to say, this requires a close and loving relationship. Because it's so painful and so difficult, it might in fact be best that it's not your closest relationship, but it has to be somebody who loves you enough as a brother or a sister in Christ to really tell you what they see, and who loves you enough to gently restore you to yourself and to the church when you begin to break apart. Because you will break apart. It's humiliating. It's humiliating, but that's exactly the point. It's a holy breaking apart. This has happened to me before in the hands of my friends, and it's something, when that happens, it's horrible and wonderful at the same time. Something more glorious than you can imagine follows from that. Now, I know that this is a hard thing to hear and to do, so if you aren't quite ready for as direct of a challenge as I've stated it, I have a couple of suggestions of steps that you can take to move in this direction. These two suggestions have the virtue of linking my first focus on gratitude and grace with the second focus on authenticity and confession. These two suggestions, I hope, offer ways for us to be intentional about learning to love one another in our life together. Now, I'm a big fan of the truism that what we do every day is far more important than what we do every once in a while. These are simple ideas that I hope have the virtue of opening up a space for God to work in your relationship with other Christians. So please resist the urge to think that this is a trick, that this somehow is the method. There's no method here. The only thing that works is attitude and intentionality in this case. So here are the two ideas, and then I'll explain them briefly. The first is to have a focused mealtime together once a week with your roommates, or if you live alone with a Christian brother or a sister. And then second, to practice some version of the daily examen. So those are my two ideas, and let me explain each briefly. The first suggestion is to have a focused mealtime. This is easier said than done. Life together, when that means actually living together with roommates or in a marriage or with your parents, is hard, really hard. I mean, when I was in college, My roommates, my senior year, they never cleaned the room. I mean, never, ever. I'd go off to the janitorial closet to get the vacuum, and I'd be the only one who cleans the room. And I had to, struggle with the grumbling that came from that. One of my roommates would even clip her toenails right into the carpet, Yeah. This reminds me of one of my favorite episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when I may be confessing a little too much here, when Buffy discovers that her freshman roommate, who had a penchant for blaring Cher ballads when she was trying to study, actually was a demon. But I digress. I loved these women that I lived with. I still love them. They're still both very dear friends of mine. But stuff builds up when you live together. You will all sin against each other. It's just a matter of time. You know what I'm talking about. Own your part in that. Learn to confess it sooner rather than later. And since this is easier said than done, a reliable plan really helps. And for us, when I was in college, we found that intentionally meeting for a weekly meal with the purpose of ending in an intercessory prayer time for each other, with each other, really worked. It provided a space for God to work in, both in preparing our hearts for it and then in the time itself. Now, if you do commit to such a meal, try to be creative and intentional about the time together. Perhaps you can do a version of what Bonhoeffer referred to as Lectio Continua, or a continual reading of the Bible chapter by chapter. You might just simply choose a book of the Bible to read aloud during this mealtime, read it as an ongoing narrative, see how it changes you. Whatever you decide to do, commit to it, commit to each other. And I do pray that such meetings will open up deeper relationships. My second suggestion is to practice a version of the daily examen. This was first proposed by St. Ignatius of Loyola in his spiritual exercises. Now, the daily examen has the virtue of being very simple. Just before you retire for the night, you ask yourselves or each other some version of the question, where did I meet Jesus today? Or, for what moment today am I the most grateful? And after that, for what moment today am I least grateful? This spiritual practice has the effect, particularly when done over time, of sharpening your focus onto the places of greatest importance on your day. If done in submission to the Lord with a prayerful heart, it helps you to locate where you are succeeding and why, where you are failing and why. It has a tendency to pinpoint that. Now, the examen can be done alone, as in, for instance, in Psalm 4, where the psalmist writes, meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still, or it can be done with others. There are two ways that I practice the daily examen at home, just to give you an example. The first is with my son, Donovan, who is just about to turn 5, so I can barely settle him down enough to do it. But every night at bedtime, I can get him to answer the question, what was your favorite part of today? And we do this just before our prayer time together so that we can incorporate gratitude to God for that thing. Now, admittedly, right now, the answer is usually something like, my favorite part of today was playing with the NASCARs. But you gotta start somewhere, right? And then I also practice the examen alone in bed each night. I put my hand on my stomach to help me to remember to breathe deeply, and then I ask this version of the questions. What was my moment of greatest consolation? What was my moment of greatest desolation? I thank God for the one, and then I release the other. Or if necessary, I confess unconfessed sins. It's really a great way before you go off to sleep to reflect on the day. I think it's great to be done alone, but I think it even has more potential when done with others. Maybe some of you want to explore this idea. If you're interested in the daily examen, you could read Ignatius of Loyola, or you could read together an interesting little book called Sleeping with Bread, Holding What Gives You Life. This book even has pictures, so it describes the various forms the daily examen can take, including variations of the questions you can ask, such as, when did I give and receive love the most today? When did I give and receive the least love today? That could be really revelatory, I think. Just thinking about the moment of giving and receiving love, or failing to give and receive love in the space of your day. Now, I think this kind of simple, honest conversation, when done over time with others, can create a possibility for that place where you might learn to confess to each other without saying, now we will have a time for confession of sins, which will never work, right? We need to build the kind of authentic relationships where it's possible to imagine confessing to each other. Again, please don't hear me saying that there's some kind of method to this, to living together, to life together. There's no method, right? The Christian life is about relationships, first to God and then to each other. That's the richness of it. That's the beauty of it. That's the opportunity of it. As Bonhoeffer reminds us very consistently throughout, if we forget that Jesus Christ is the reason why we were together to begin with and the head of it all, then no Christian community or family will ever work. So we've got to keep him, cultivating a relationship with him first, and relationships with each other secondly. I do pray that for you this year, that you develop these kinds of friendships. These are friendships that will go on with you through the course of your life, so it's time well spent. And I say that as somebody who believes that the main purpose of being in college is to do your studies. But if you don't cultivate these relationships and learn how to love each other, then the rest of it, what's the point? So please let me pray for you. Father, I pray for these students who are listening here, that you would enrich their lives with friendships that are deep, that are honest, and that will help each one of these to be brought into greater conformity with you. In Jesus' name, amen.